Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Hey guys, one of the things I don't like about using the the built-in webcam in the computer is that I feel like I'm like almost making eye contact with you guys like the whole time because like I'm looking at the screen, but then there's the and it's weird. All right, I hello. Let's do it. 300. Go.
Leonidas and his 300 Spartan warriors are surrounded by Persian forces. The Spartans deflect blow after blow with their shields as enemy soldiers crash against them like a wave in a storm. Spears shoot out of the Spartan line like lightning, tearing through enemy flesh, but they are vastly outnumbered. Many began to fall. Shields are splintered, spears broken in two. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans retreat up a hill to make their final stand. Suddenly, an arrow enters the chest of the great king. Leonidas falls to the ground as his blood soaks into the earth around him. The Battle of Thermopylae went down in history as one of the most awe-inspiring fights of all time. But how much of what we see on the big screen and TV is actually true? Not everything you've watched or read about the Battle of Thermopylae is correct, but some truths are even more incredible than the dramatizations of Hollywood. The invasion of Greece by the Persians was predicated on revenge more than anything else. Xerxes, the ruler of the Persian Empire, had lived with the brutal defeat of his father's forces by the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon. His father was Darius, king of everything, and everyone from Egypt to West India. But he never managed to conquer the Greeks. The inability to defeat the Greeks was both a devastating blow and a humiliating blunder for the ruling family of Persia. Xerxes was determined to crush the insolence of the Greeks once and for all. 10 years after the failed invasion of
Guys, did the Persians and the Chinese ever come into conflict, or were they too separated by the Indus Valley and the Himalayas and the Asian steppe?
Greece by Darius, Xerxes would launch his own campaign into the heart of the country to the west. This time, however, the Spartans of legend would join the battle. There would be so much bloodshed and destruction during the Battle of Thermopylae that the final stand of the 300 would never be forgotten. In 480 BCE, Xerxes and his forces began marching toward the center of Greece toward Athens. At the time, many Greek city-states were warring with one another. But when Athens received word of their impending doom at the hands of the Persians, they pleaded with the other Greek city-states to form an army to stop the invasion force. The Athenians had been able to fend off Darius and his forces in the past, but Xerxes commanded an army many times larger than his father. Surprisingly, Sparta answered Athens' plea for help. Up until that point, Sparta had stayed out of conflicts with Persia, but the leaders of the great city-states saw this new threat to their people and land as too great to ignore and decided the Persians must be stopped at all costs. From scouting missions and allies to the east, the Greeks received word that Xerxes' army was enormous. It was estimated that he commanded somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 men. This military force would be much harder to defeat than the one Darius had brought with him a decade earlier. If the Greeks were not prepared, this would spell the end of democracy and their very way of life. Sparta knew that the only way Greece would be able to survive this invasion would be if they could gather soldiers from across the city-states together, but this would take time. It was decided that the only possibility for success would be if Xerxes' forces could be slowed down, giving Greece more time to organize their defenses. Scouts were sent across the lands of Greece to find a location to make a stand, someplace where the number of soldiers Xerxes had wouldn't matter. Tensions were high as some Greek city-states refused to join the cause, while others blatantly backed the Persian forces and welcomed their new overlords. But Sparta and Athens would not let the progress they'd made and the freedoms their people enjoyed be taken away by a foreign power. The scouts eventually returned with a location that suited their needs. There was a narrow pass at Thermopylae that the Persian army would need to pass through to get from northern Greece into the center where Athens and Sparta were located. Thermopylae also sat near waterways that connected mainland Greece to the Aegean Sea, which meant Athens' formidable navy would be able to hold off Persian ships and prevent any forces from landing on the shores behind Thermopylae. This would stop the Persians from circling behind the Greek forces deployed at the narrow pass, making sure the only way into central Greece was by land. It was the best possible location for a defense, and the Greeks' only hope for slowing down the swarm of Persian soldiers approaching their lands. However, this location was literally the spitting image of hell. The location was named Thermopylae, which translates to hot gates, because the landscape was filled with hot sulfur springs. This created an eerie mist that covered parts of the battlefield and a terrible smell. A more ominous location could not have been chosen even if they'd tried. The Greeks' plan to slow Xerxes now had its foundation, but there was a problem. Xerxes was already close, and there wasn't enough time to send all of the Greek armies to Thermopylae. In fact, many city-states still didn't think there was an invasion force coming at all. It also didn't help that the Olympics and several important religious festivals were happening at the end of the summer, which would be at the same time that Xerxes' forces would reach the hot gates. Many city-states were so focused on these other events that they couldn't be bothered by something as trivial as a massive invasion force knocking on their front door. Sparta decided they couldn't wait for the rest of Greece to come to their senses. They needed to send a force to secure the hot gates and give the rest of the city-states time to organize their militaries. After weighing their options, Sparta determined that they needed to send one of their 2 kings and a force of 300 elite soldiers to Thermopylae to hold the hot gates as long as possible. The king chosen for this mission was Leonidas, but before he could head out, Sparta needed to speak with the oracle at Delphi. This was not an uncommon occurrence. The oracle needed to be consulted before going to war and making major decisions. However, when the oracle looked into the future, they had bad news for the Spartans.
That would just be the best job ever, being an oracle. I'm sure they're pretty... I mean, how would they tell if you're wrong?
The oracle foretold that the Persians would destroy either Sparta as a whole or one of the kings of Sparta would need to die. When this prophecy reached Leonidas, he did not hesitate for a moment. He would gladly lay down his own life if it meant securing victory for Sparta. Now that the oracle had been consulted, Leonidas needed to select his 300 soldiers and head to Thermopylae to prepare for battle. It seems likely that Leonidas knew that he and his forces would not be making it back alive, as he only chose men who had already had a male heir to carry on their family lineage. Spartan warriors fought until victory or death, and since they were so outnumbered and the main objective was to slow Xerxes down as much as possible, no one was coming home. Also,
that's smart, not just because it's like a nice thing to do, like you'll live on, don't worry, but it also make them more willing to lay down their life. Okay.
Leonidas had the oracle's prophecy to contend with. Unless he somehow managed to defeat 100,000 men with his 300 Spartans and a handful of other Greek soldiers, he would need to fight to the death in order to ensure the prophecy was fulfilled and Sparta itself did not fall. Sparta recruited as many other soldiers as possible for the mission from their allies and the surrounding area. The Athenians were in charge of protecting the seas, so they could only offer a limited number of soldiers upon land. Upon departure for Thermopylae, Leonidas had his army of 300 Spartan soldiers and around 7,000 other men made up of Athenians, 1,000 Phocians, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans. The force marched from central Greece to Thermopylae. The stage was set for the greatest battle in ancient history. In late July or early August of 480 BCE, Leonidas and his forces reached the hot gates and set up their defenses. They were a few days ahead of the Persians, which gave them time to scout out the area and make sure everyone knew what to do during battle. The Spartans were hardened warriors who had fought in wars before. However, the same could not be said.
I just want to say this area right here might be like the coolest looking geographical feature, like from above, I think that there might be in the world. Just this cool, like trident looking peninsula in Greece. I think is so cool looking. It's like if you had a city on the middle peninsula. It's like something you would see created in like an MMORPG, something like a video game.
Battle. The Spartans were hardened warriors who had fought in wars before. However, no one knew what to do during battle. The Spartans were hardened warriors who had fought in wars before. However, the same could not be said about all the soldiers that made up the rest of Leonidas' resistance force. The pass through the hot gates was approximately 20 to 100 meters across. On one side was a sheer cliff that dropped into a sea below. On the other were impenetrable, jagged mountains. With his 300 Spartans at the front and in key positions along the opening of the pass, Leonidas could fend off the oncoming Persian forces. The narrowness of the hot gates rendered the number advantage that Xerxes had over the Greeks almost completely useless, and would mean that his cavalry wouldn't be able to outflank Greek forces. But would this be enough to allow Leonidas and his men to slow the Persian army? Only time would tell. Up until this point, Xerxes and his military had met little resistance. They had marched across the Persian Empire, crossed the Dardanelles Strait on 2 pontoon bridges, and made their way through northern Greece to Thermopylae. As Leonidas waited for the Persian army to reach the hot gates, he sent men out to scout the area. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. The Spartans and their allies were eating and preparing themselves for battle when one of the scouts frantically returned to the camp. He had terrible news. A hidden path in the mountains led from where the Persians would be camped to behind the Greek line. If the Persians discovered the trail, they'd be able to surround the Greeks and massacre them. Leonidas didn't have enough men to fend off attacks from both the front and going according to return to the camp. He had terrible news. A hidden path in the mountains led from where the Persians would be camped to behind the Greek line. If the Persians discovered the trail, they'd be able to surround the Greeks and massacre them. Leonidas didn't have enough men to fend off attacks from both the front and the back of his resistance force. Leonidas sent 1,000 Phocians to guard the path in case the Persians discovered it. When Xerxes and his forces finally arrived at Thermopylae, they decided to wait 4 days before commencing their attack. One reason for this was to give the Persian troops time to rest, but Xerxes also had something else in mind. He was almost positive that when the Greeks saw the size of his army, they'd run away in fear. Much to the dismay of Xerxes, this did not happen. The Spartans had no intention of giving up Thermopylae and letting the Persians pass without a fight. After waiting a few days to see if the Greeks would just give up, Xerxes sent an envoy to ask Leonidas to lay down his arms. According to the philosopher Plutarch, Leonidas' response was, "Come and take them." Xerxes did not receive this defiance very well and decided it was time to prepare for battle. Before launching his first attacks, he sent scouts to see how the Spartans were doing in preparation for battle.
Chills.
The report shocked the Persian king. The scouts had found the Spartans exercising naked and grooming each other's hair. The reason for this likely had to do with the religious and funerary beliefs of the Spartans. Since Spartan soldiers fought until they were victorious or dead, they needed to ensure their bodies were prepared for the afterlife. Therefore, before a battle, they would groom each other. Another little-known fact about the way Spartans looked was that all Spartan men shaved their upper lip. Like most Greek men, they still let their beards grow long, but the upper lip was always shaved. 5 days after arriving in Thermopylae, Xerxes ordered his troops forward.
Wonder why.
He was sure that the superior numbers would make quick work of the small Greek
Like, I know he just said why, but like, what's the reasoning?
force, so he initiated troops forward. He was sure that the superior numbers would make quick work of the small Greek force, so he initially sent only his most mediocre soldiers into battle. Xerxes quickly found out that this was a huge mistake. The Spartans' fighting ability was unmatched by any other soldiers in the field. The Greeks had been practicing their tactics on the rough terrain of Thermopylae for several days.
That's like giving them, you know, in the movie Longest Yard, they have. It's just that movie's making me think of it. How like they want like a pre-game that's really easy to get the team all psyched up for the real game. It's like that's what you're kind of doing. It's like you're building up their confidence,
which also gave them a slight advantage. They used a phalanx formation of Thermopylae for several days, which all field. The Greeks had been practicing their tactics on the rough terrain of Thermopylae for several days, which also gave them a slight advantage. They used a phalanx formation, which was extremely effective in the tight spaces of the hot gates, and the Greek warriors would stand shoulder to shoulder, forming a wall of shields in front of them. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers crashed against the Greek line, but it did not break. The phalanx was so successful because the Greek shields were stronger than the Persian weapons, and their spears provided a further reach. The Persians were using short javelins and wicker shields. These definitely provided them an advantage in open field combat as they offered more mobility, but in the tight quarters of Thermopylae, these weapons were just not as effective against the heavily armed Spartans. It seemed that no matter what they did, the Persians couldn't get past the front line of the Greeks. Leonidas and his Spartans were fierce. They would patiently wait for a buildup of Persian soldiers against their shields and then use their spears from further back to decimate any enemy who left themselves vulnerable to attack. Imagine being a Persian soldier and watching line after line of your comrades die at the hands of Spartan warriors. Each wave of attack brings you closer to the deadly phalanx. You find yourself face to face with Greek shields. At your feet are the dead bodies of your friends. You look up and lock eyes with Leonidas as his spear rockets out from behind the phalanx and through your heart. It's no wonder that many Persian soldiers turned and fled the battlefield after witnessing the carnage that the Spartans unleashed. After hours of battling, the ground was soaked in Persian blood while the Greeks sustained minor casualties. Xerxes realized he needed to try a different tactic and ordered his archers to release a barrage of arrows at the Spartan forces. Unfortunately for the Persians, their arrows were about as effective as their soldiers were against the Greek shields and armor, which is to say they had little to no effect at all. For 2 days, everything went according to plan for Leonidas and his army. Even Xerxes' most elite fighters, the Immortals, couldn't defeat the Spartans and their allies. This group of soldiers got its name from the ability to immediately replace casualties, making it seem that their numbers never diminished. However, the Greeks' luck was about to change. It was said that during the first 2 days of battle, the Spartans and other Greek forces killed over 10,000 Persian soldiers. They sustained some of their own casualties, but most of the Greek force was still strong and could continue fighting indefinitely. Xerxes watched the battle from his golden throne atop a nearby hill. He became so enraged at the defeat of his soldiers, he jumped up from his seat and screamed in anger. This was unbecoming for a ruler who was seen as a god by his followers. Leonidas and his 300 Spartan warriors and the other Greek soldiers had done the impossible. They'd stopped the Persian war machine in its tracks. During the second day of the Battle of Thermopylae, a local Greek shepherd by the name of Ephialtes asked for an audience with Xerxes. He told the guards he had information that would allow the Persians to defeat the Spartans. At this point, Xerxes had lost all patience. It seemed that the wall of Greek soldiers soldiers would not be broken. He was ready to try anything. Ephialtes eventually got his meeting with Xerxes, and in exchange for a huge sum of money, he told the Persian emperor of the Anopaia path that went through the mountains and ended up behind the Greek defensive line. Xerxes dispatched his immortals to encircle Leonidas and his forces. By cover of night, they left the Persian camp and traveled through the mountains. When the immortals reached the 1,000 Phocians Leonidas had ordered to guard the mountain pass, they quickly defeated them. Some accounts say the Phocians didn't even put up a fight but ran away in fear as they spotted the enemy soldiers. Either way, the Persians were coming. Luckily, word reached Leonidas before the enemy forces did. The Spartan king ordered his men and the rest of the Greek forces to retreat. Leonidas before the enemy forces did. The Spartan king ordered his men were coming. Luckily, word reached Leonidas before the enemy forces did. The Spartan king ordered his men and the rest of the Greek forces to retreat further south to make their final stand. But before the battle would take place, Leonidas did something that would secure his name in the history books forever. Leonidas decided that all of the Greek soldiers could leave the battle and return home to fight another day. However, he and his 300 Spartans would stay and hold off the Persians as long as possible, taking as many with them before they were killed. Along with the Spartans, a group of Thebans would also stay and fight, but the remaining soldiers were to be sent back to their cities to tell the tale of Leonidas and the 300 Spartans who defied a Persian king and slaughtered thousands of his men. It would seem that Leonidas would indeed fulfill the prophecy of the oracle. As the sun rose on the third day of the Battle of Thermopylae, Leonidas gathered his men. They all knew what was to come, and they were happy to die for their king and for Sparta. Leonidas looked at each of them in turn.
It's like they're disappointed they haven't died yet, and so they're like, all right, you guys leave, just us.
Was to come, and they were happy to die for their king and for Sparta. Leonidas looked at each of them in turn before the day got underway, at which point he said, "Have a hearty breakfast, for tonight we dine in Hades." Later that night, the immortals arrived from the mountain pass, and a huge force of Persian soldiers advanced through the hot gates toward the Spartans. There are two different accounts of what happened next in the epic tale of Leonidas and his 300 warriors. Ephorus and Diodorus Siculus say that like a dangerous beast trapped in a corner, Leonidas decided to do something unpredictable and attack first. In this scenario, the Spartans charged into the Persian camp and slaughtered a large number of soldiers before being pushed back. The other account by Herodotus states that the Persians struck first, but not before Xerxes presented an offering to the gods for his generals before launching the final attack that would wipe out the Spartans. Either way, the outcome of what came next was the same. Leonidas and his men repositioned themselves in an open area where they'd be able to move around better and kill as many Persian soldiers as possible. As the immortals closed in on one side and the rest of Xerxes' forces moved in on the other, the Spartans began fighting in a frenzied manner. They did not forget their training, but used every method at their disposal to rip through the Persians. As their spears broke off inside of enemy soldiers and their shields shattered from slamming into the bodies of the immortals, the Spartans drew their swords and began to slash their way through the Persian ranks. It was a bloodbath, but there were just too many Persians. Less than 300 Spartans and a handful of other Greek soldiers remained against the might of the entire Persian army. Xerxes still had tens of thousands of soldiers at his disposal, while there was no hope for reinforcements or relief from the Greeks. During the carnage, Leonidas fell. His men surrounded their king and fought off the hordes of enemy soldiers. They managed to grab Leonidas and pull his body to safety until he passed away from the wounds. At the time of the Battle of Thermopylae, Leonidas was somewhere between 50 and 60 years old. He was by no means a young man, but Spartan warriors started their training as teenagers and would serve in the military until their 60s, so it's not surprising that Leonidas was still fighting at this age. The fact that he killed so many enemies while also commanding a Greek troop at the Battle of Thermopylae makes him one of the most respected warriors of all time. Even after Leonidas fell, the Spartans that remained continued to fight. They had fallen back to higher ground and used a protective wall to slow the onslaught of enemy troops. Many of them had lost their swords, shields, and spears, so they fought with their bare hands. An unarmed Spartan warrior was still a deadly adversary. The Persians knew this, and even after breaking down the Spartan protective wall and seeing that many of them were unarmed, they did not advance. The Persian soldiers could see in the eyes of the Spartans that if they got too close, they would very likely lose their lives. So the Persians took the easy way out. Rather than trying to defeat the Spartans in hand-to-hand combat, they used bows and arrows to kill the remaining warriors. This may seem like a cowardly thing to do, but after witnessing how much damage and death the Spartans had caused over the last 3 days,
Cowardly in battle, it's a smart decision.
they probably wanted to stay as far away from them as possible. A barrage of arrows was fired into the remaining Spartans, killing them all. Now that the defiant Spartans had been defeated, Xerxes could move freely across the battlefield without fear of being killed. He did not fight alongside his soldiers like Leonidas did. Once the Battle of Thermopylae ended, Xerxes had Leonidas' head cut off and his body impaled on a stake.
I was about to say, where are the head chopping offs? It's like the receipt of the ancient world is a severed head.
After Xerxes and his forces moved on, Greek citizens recovered the bodies of the dead soldiers, including Leonidas, and buried them at Thermopylae. After the Persian War ended, a stone monument in the shape of a lion was erected on the spot where the 300 Spartans were buried. On it, the words, "Go tell the Spartans, thou that passest by, that here obedient to their words we lie," were written by the poet Simonides. Basically, he was saying that the 300 Spartans who said they would fight to the death to slow the advance of the Persian army were true to their word. Now, to be fair, several Spartan soldiers died in the battle before the final stand. Also, King Leonidas allowed 2 Spartans who were ill to return home instead of forcing them to fight in the final battle. One refused to leave and was killed with the rest, while the other, a man named Aristodemus, did return home to Sparta. However, once he reached the city, he instantly regretted his decision. From the moment Aristodemus stepped foot in Sparta, he was shunned by everyone in the city. The fact that he had abandoned his duty and left his king to die on the battlefield was unforgivable. Aristodemus was stripped of his civic rights and had to carry his disgrace as a coward for the rest of his life. Luckily for Aristodemus, that wouldn't be very long. The next year, he joined a campaign to fight the Persians once again at the Battle of Plataea. It was said Aristodemus fought like a madman as he wanted to...
Can I just say what a great tool religion really has been in a time where you don't really know, like, it's really hard to say, it's really hard to scare anyone nowadays into just believing something after you die, you know, like, into believing something that happens, like, ooh, this is going to happen after you die. And so that last thing that someone has that you can't take away, like, what are you going to do, kill me, is like, well, you can still lose even more after that. And having the way of, like, the gods and, like, honor, and of course there's still honor today, and if you could have a soldier today do something similar and feel the same regret. But from just all of these cool, like, magical things in the past that weren't magical, but they might as well have been because people really believed it. I just think it's really fascinating and cool, and says a lot about society, I guess, and the human mind, or just, yeah.
Make up for his shameful decision to leave the Battle of Thermopylae. He ran to the front lines in a rage-filled fury and slashed again at the Battle of Plataea. It was said on. The next year, he joined a campaign to fight the Persians once again at the Battle of Plataea. It was said Aristodemus fought like a madman as he wanted to make up for his shameful decision to leave the Battle of Thermopylae. He ran to the front lines in a rage-filled fury and slashed apart the Persian ranks until he was finally brought down and killed. There is no doubt that Leonidas, his 300 Spartans, and other Greek soldiers who fought at the Battle of Thermopylae slowed down the Persian advance through Greece. But there was a much more important effect that the battle had on the Greek populace. After the story of the 300 spread across the lands of Greece,
I feel like if you're in a rage, you got the, like, if you're like scared or sad and everything, you know, you don't have that adrenaline to really take away the pain. I don't really know. I've never had a serious injury. But everyone has at least had a little bit of adrenaline and not felt something. And I'm sure going into battle like that made it for a much more pleasant death, at least feeling-wise, pain.
More and more people felt it was their duty to fight. This was a matter of pride for many, and a way to avenge the deaths of the 300 Spartans who had fallen at the Battle of Thermopylae. It was also clear at this point that the Persians were coming for everyone, and all men who could fight needed to do so. The Spartans stopped the Persian forces at the Hot Gates for several days and did significant damage to their ranks and morale. The Persian soldiers who fought against Leonidas and his 300 Spartans would not soon forget how vicious and deadly they were. As Xerxes' armies marched into Greece, they were met by an even larger Spartan force, which must have been incredibly intimidating. The victories at Salamis and Plataea led to the Greeks finally defeating the invading Persian force and pushing them out of their borders. The sacrifice made by the men at the Battle of Thermopylae was definitely a call to arms for many Greeks. Without it, the Persians may very well have conquered the rest of Greece and enveloped it into their empire. Around 440 BCE, decades after the Persian Wars were over, the bones of Leonidas were dug up and brought back to Sparta. His tomb still exists where the modern city of Sparta is today. Now watch Most Hardcore Soldier, Spartan.
Chills.
Or check out one Navy SEAL versus the Spartan 300. Who actually would win?
Because of the fact that a Navy SEAL, well, you're going to run out of bullets. And there's no way that, like, your weapon is going to scare them because they want to die. And so I feel like your only chance to survive a Navy SEAL against the 300 is to, like, look like a god or something with these crazy weapons, so they back down. Because if you're not getting an airstrike or artillery that's gonna kill all of them, then obviously eventually you're gonna die. I should watch that though. Cool video, really cool. Yeah, oh yeah, I'm still up here. All right, see you guys next time. I'm gonna try and get back in my room. See ya. Hope you're all doing well. Bye.